This introductory podcast is for the short story An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, and I'm going to just introduce a few things about the author and prepare you for the story as a whole as to what we need to look for, and maybe even read the beginning of the story. Regardless, we're going to need the slides presentation that I shared with you called Bierce, as well as your e-fictions text. And this story can be found on page 251. So have those two things out because I will be referring to both of them. First slide in the presentation I shared with you, typically we watch like a scene from Mission Impossible or something on the way into class, an action scene that's really unrealistic, and then we discuss why people enjoy these kinds of scenes in books and movies, even though they're impossible and unrealistic. And of course, it's because it's exciting, it's because of the special effects and everything. But what we have to understand is that when it comes to romantic literature of the 19th century, that there were many stories like Masque of the Red Death and other kinds of things that aren't realistic. But I think that what somebody like Ambrose Bierce is talking about and is critical of are stories that were really unrealistic and couldn't happen, and that it seemed like the author and the audience had no real understanding of this, especially things about war and the way that people behave in battle. Very different the way that it's depicted on screen compared to the way that it really happens. And so if you take a look at slide 2, remember that literary realism, which was a movement between the wars, essentially, World War I and the Civil War, is basically what we're talking about. And that realism is nothing more and nothing less than the truthful treatment of material, simply to demonstrate what life is really like in terms of characters' thoughts, in terms of behavior, in terms of actions and settings. Slide 3, Ambrose Bierce, definitely one of the more cynical writers in terms of his body of work, in terms of his life. I mean, his nickname was Bitter Bierce. That's not just because he was from Ohio, which is bad enough, but that he fought in the Civil War and just was kind of aware of mankind's capacity for destruction and killing. He's best known for the Devil's Dictionary, which is set up like a dictionary, and the next slide actually is an example from it, where he describes realism as being the art of depicting nature as it is seen by toads, the charm suffusing a landscape painted by a mole, or a story written by a measuring worm. And so in his writing, which was realism, he's attempting to be detached and objective. If we go on to slide 5, the realist movement caught on in the U.S., partly just because of the war between the states, the Civil War, and how bloody it was, and kind of like as America losing its innocence a bit. And so this paved the way for a kind of more depressing, pessimistic outlook on life. But industrialization and basically the individual losing a lot of purpose and meaning, working in factories, living in cities, compared to being, say, the town baker or town blacksmith, something like that. And then Darwinism, again, that highlighted the idea that man is nothing more than an evolved animal. The move west, too, because local color was an important part of realism, and the interest that people had in what was going on in different parts of the country and what people were like and how they spoke and everything was a common element. And then the last slide there, I just have pretty much what we went over on Monday in terms of realism versus romanticism and how we're going to see that difference here. And so let's take a look at the story itself. All right. First, on page 251, this is part 1. If you turn to page 253, you see that there's a part 2. Part 2 is going to be a flashback. Okay? Part 1 is about this man who's about to be executed. And what we want to look for in part one is how detailed it is. It gets a little bit boring, but at the same time, this is describing the way a man would actually have been executed during the Civil War on this railroad bridge. And it's a very specific description, but very realistic. And as we get to the end of that section, you see the final line there is going to be a very heavy one, meaning that there's a lot in that sentence beyond what it appears to be from the start. Then, after that, part two is a flashback. And Peyton Farquhar is the guy who was being executed. And so this is basically what he did wrong that caused him to be tried and sentenced to death. So that's part two. Part three then continues on from the execution. And it only goes to page 257. So just read carefully and be ready for a quiz on Friday. After the reading, there's another podcast about the story and some difficult parts throughout that you can listen to as well. Thanks for listening.